Well, good morning. We usually say good evening, good morning. Well, it depends on where in the world you are, and where in the world you are matters, because today, the special edition of 5 Minutes with Robert and Amy Nasir, we have the opportunity to speak once again for the second time to the historian Scott Powell. Scott, how are you doing on this fine morning?
I'm doing really great on this fine afternoon.
Yes, yes.
You said it depends where you are in the world at the moment. I happen to be very lucky to be in the Albanian Riviera, so I'm enjoying this afternoon very much.
Albania, so that would put it about, what would it be? What is the local time there right now? Just curious.
2 o'clock in the afternoon.
2 in the afternoon. Outstanding. Well, it's 8 in the morning here. I know we've got friends on the West Coast who are wondering why they're waking up so early, but a good reason to start your day early to speak to Scott Powell, the author of The History of Now and Now, The History of Tomorrow. That release is coming up very, very soon. What was the date on that? I should have had that right in front of me. History of Tomorrow. Now, this is coming out on Kindle, right? This is coming out as an ebook?
It'll be a print edition, and it will be on Kindle.
Oh, good. I only saw the ebook edition early, but it will be in a print. Good, because I prefer the Dead Tree version of that.
Yeah, it says that the it's going to be on Kindle September 2nd.
Outstanding. September 2nd.
Yeah, the Atlas Shrugged Day.
Atlas Shrugged Day. That was that.
That wasn't planned, but it worked out. The reason why I chose it was I knew that I needed to get it in with a couple months lead time for Election Day, so that was my goal.
Outstanding.
Very good.
Well, for folks who didn't hear the previous interview and don't already know Scott's work, Scott Powell is an historian and teacher who has been teaching homeschooled students online for nearly 20 years. The author of 3 books, including The 4-Hour Historian, The History of Now, and the upcoming History of Tomorrow. Now, the description on Amazon says his present-centric approach was developed from the conviction that history is an essential subject that is vital for anyone who wants to live a fully engaged life and make sense of the world they live in. Well, that could be the whole interview right there, but I know folks who didn't hear us last time and aren't familiar with your work right away are saying present-centric. What does that mean? And we talked about that in March when we talked last time, but this is it's really a paradigm shift. I shouldn't use that expression, it's overused, but it's a fascinating way of making history relevant. We hear all the time, let's make history relevant, and the kids do play acting of an event that happened in the past, and that's great, and I have nothing against that, but this is something else altogether. Scott, how would you describe, well, you've got a whole book and it warrants reading, but how would you describe present-centric history?
Right. Yeah, certainly. That's a great place to start. So present centrism is a mode of historical cognition that seeks to provide a revelation and explanation of the world we live in.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you say a mode as against a method. This is an entire way of I shouldn't put it this way, but a whole way of doing history, of understanding history.
Or approach, perhaps?
It's a whole way of thinking, yes.
Yeah.
And you say revelation, it does reveal the connections of what has happened to where we're at now. And it's interesting because in the last interview you talked about cardinal anchor facts, and you'll read about this, folks, in the History of Now and in the History of Tomorrow. Events like 1492 and 1776, where today can't be understood without understanding how we got here. And I was curious if you could tell the audience, when we talk about now, when we talk about what history means for now, in what ways do these cardinal anchor facts, these I think events is too small a word, affect us now? For example, the world is America-centric, and you talk about that. Well, let's talk about that, because when we think America-centric, those of us who have appreciation for what happened in 1776, we think, well, we've lost that. But it's a loose sense. We kind of mean it. You understand this far better in that we're not the same America that we were in that period before World War I. when America was focused on America and we were a republic, and now you describe us as a democracy. What is the distinction that you're drawing there?
Right. So in present centrism, of course, the idea is that we're studying history in order to understand the world that we live in. Right? So cardinal anchor facts, the ones you referred to, are really great choices, such as 1492, 1776. Those anchor facts are, in fact, the ones you chose are a very special category of cardinal anchor facts pertaining to how we structure our awareness of the entire history of the world. So when we're trying to comprehend history, which is of course a plethora, it's a vast ocean of information, which is impossible to assimilate and to comprehend without a proper method. What we need is these points that organize our awareness and help us to understand how the cultural blocks of the world arose in the configuration that they presently exhibit. And so 1492, of course, is when the Europeans started coming to America. So now we have the rise of new cultural blocks: United States, Anglosphere, which includes Canada, and the Iberosphere, which is obviously all of Latin America and Brazil. So these are new cultural blocks that didn't exist before. They're part of the configuration of the world we live in. And of course, America, starting in 1776 with its unique values, just catapulted past everybody else, all these established culture. China had been around for 4,000 years, Europe for almost as long, and so on, right? And then all of a sudden, this upstart, this prodigal culture comes along and absolutely dominates history from that point on. I mean, of course, there was a lead up. There was a proto-industrial period where things were just kind of getting started, and America still had its own business to take care of course, with slavery and finally the Civil War and so on. And then things really started to accelerate, and the modern world starts to take shape. And so that's, what we're trying to understand here is, what is that modern world? It's a world that has 200 countries in it. Absolutely, yeah, but that's not a useful frame. Just like if you're trying to memorize 200 historical facts, you're going to end up with a useless list. So, of course, 200 countries is not a framework for cognition. So one of the first things that I do for my students is always take this geography and rework it, integrate it properly into the framework of what I call cultural blocks. And what's revealed is that, yeah, it's 200 countries, but as it turns out, there are these things which I termed cultural blocks, such as the most obvious one is the European Union, right? It's a supranational integration of these various cultures. And there are others that have different kinds of affinity between the member states. But basically what that allows you to do is it allows you to see, well, there really are 10 big chunks. There are some smaller ones as well, some outliers, but there are these really 10 big chunks, culturally speaking. And if we learn to see history in that way, then a lot of things are immediately become much easier to understand. And within that set of 10, there are, as I call them, 5 cardinal cultures. Cardinality here is from the Latin word cardo, hinge. So that upon which history hinges, right? Is these are the cultures that have the most to say about where we're going, right? So in other words, 50 years from now, the history of the world is not going to be determined by Latin America, right? These are not cultures that will have said, yeah, we're taking over, okay? From now on, you'll do as we say, right? No, that's what cardinal cultures do. That's what China does. That's what America does, right? That's what these rare cultures do. And so we've got 5 cardinal cultures. And then, of course, the culmination of this organizational framework is that, okay, yeah, true enough, we've got 5, but it's obvious if you even just take a glance at world affairs that there's only one world police power, so militarily dominant, culturally influential, and economically also, the most important country. The country with the world reserve currency, the country that exports its KFCs and its McDonald's and its Disney and its everything, right? And other countries have to erect, legal barriers to entry to American products just to try to maintain their cultural identity. Countries like France and Canada and so on. So yeah, this is an America-centric world. And so that is perhaps more of the focus in the history of tomorrow than it is in the history of now. The purpose of the history of now was to provide a compendium of the 5 cardinal cultures and explain how did they come to be in the place that they are, what are they, how are they interacting, and help us to see, okay, this is how the world we live in arose. The history of tomorrow, as the name suggests, is, well, okay, that's nice, but we've got work to do here, because an outline of history clearly is not going to give you, especially, as I intend, predictive capacity, right? You've got to have a higher resolution understanding of how history is unfolding in order to make any sensible predictions. So that's what's done in the history of tomorrow, with the emphasis, of course, on the United States, because it has primacy, because the ways in which it acts have a way of dominating the other vectors in history. And so that's the purpose, is to study America, its relationship to other cultures, and to say, okay, where is this going?
It's interesting because in history, you know, I had grade school history, college level history, and history was more egalitarian than that. They, excuse me, they would be hesitant to say, you know, America has an outsized impact on history. We need to understand from an Americanistic perspective the world, because no other country in the world does what America does. And looking at, I'm in any community, I am the optimist in the room. Looking at statistics, the kind of statistics where we say, oh my God, everything's getting better all the time. Why are we all pessimists? America, the dominance of American culture comes out in almost all of the numbers. When we look at, well, countries are doing better now than they ever have before. Advanced countries, or countries that are hopefully becoming advanced. Border countries like China and India, and places where they should have outshone us, but they don't because of their cultures. So it's interesting that you are anything but a historical egalitarian. And you're right, in the history of tomorrow, you're right, the key to a proper prediction about the fate of this configuration of cultures is to see that the actions of both waning Americanistic and emerging post-Americanistic foreign policy have resulted not merely in the proliferation of unintended consequences, but in the literal opposite of their stated intentions, so frequently as to be demoralizing. And you go on to explain that, and yes, it's an America-dominated world, no, not just militarily, but culturally, but there is that change, which you describe as having happened around World War I. There are people who describe themselves as America first or isolationist in ways that are not particularly well grounded, but you really make the case that in becoming the world's policeman and engaging in World War I, that was the big change. And so I would love to know, going forward in the history of tomorrow, what do you see for the world, meaning what do you see for America's impact on the world? Do we continue this slide into the world first and America second, and essentially nationalistic humility?
Yeah. So let's focus on the term Americanistic, which you used, and it's a very important term to me. So I would describe American culture ever since World War II in the fullest sense as Americanistic. So what does that mean? Right? You get kind of simple, you have simplistic, you have Americanistic. What is the reason for that particular usage? So as I talk about in the history of tomorrow, I drew some inspiration there from a German art historian named Droysen. And some of you might be familiar, with art history, and it's a really interesting periodization involved there, where he made the case that there were two fundamental periods in the history of ancient Greek art. He termed the first Hellenic, right, in which the essence of what the Greeks were producing reflected their unique cultural values. So that's where you see the discus thrower, and you see these wonderful statues that are part of the Parthenon and so on, right? And so there's a style and there's content there that's uniquely Hellenic, he proposed. And then what he said was, well, after Alexander the Great, there was this hybridization, effectively, of Greek culture, the intermingling of the Greek with the Asiatic. And he termed the new development Hellenistic. So I thought that was a really fantastic description. And I adopted that in the history of now, and I extend upon that characterization in the history of tomorrow. What we have is a culture that is, of its own essence, unique, wonderful, in both cases, with Hellenic and American. And then we have this hybridization process in which there is an intermixture and a hybridization involving another culture. And unfortunately, in both cases, it's an inferior culture. And so the outcome is ultimately inferior to the original incarnation that you have. So what do I mean by American? Well, as you pointed out in versus Americanistic. Well, as you pointed out in the history of now, the characterization is based entirely on foreign policy, which is, it's an oversimplification, but one that was necessary in the context, because in the history of now, the idea is, what are the main cultures and how do they interact? So it's largely based on how different cultures align with one another, not necessarily what are their internal workings, right? So in that context, Americanistic means, or American means the original idea of independence and political separation, right? So the Declaration of Independence and fundamentally the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, a few other milestones along the way, right? And that lasted basically until World War I. At that point, Woodrow Wilson comes along and he says, I've got a new mission for you, America. I want you to go out and make the world safe for democracy, right? Now, that's a very telling formulation, because he did not say, we need to go out and make the world safe for republics. No. He said democracies. Why? Well, as I talk about in the history of tomorrow, America's own social contract had changed by that point. So in other words, the original American Republic was a country, of course, aspirationally, but also to a large extent, successfully implementing the idea of natural rights, of individual rights. There were these, of course, these elements that were incompatible with that, these incoherencies, primarily having to do with slavery and mercantilism. And so those things definitely created problems, and America was not able to resolve those things. But so ultimately there was the slavery issue, of course, that brought about, and with mercantilism, kind of playing a role as well, in the form of the tariff and things like that people complain about in relation to that story. And so you get that leading to the Civil War, which is the collapse of the original American social contract, the original terms of reference and mode of living in which Americans say, this is what we're going to do. Some of us are going to have slaves, and you know what? We're gonna tolerate that. Okay, most of us don't like it, and so on. Okay, but we're going to make a deal. We have to have a union for a variety of pragmatic reasons for that. And okay, we tried to work it out, but we couldn't come up with a way to fix that. All right, so now we got to solve this. The abolitionists came along and pushed everybody and said, okay, no more. And so, all right, that social contract, that arrangement, that way of life broke, right? Lincoln's elected, the South secedes, boom, there's a cataclysm. And then America has to start rebuilding after that. It's at that point that the Americanistic, as I call it, social contract begins to arise. And I call it Americanistic because it involves not only natural rights, but something that was imported from France, the social theory of rights. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the social contract. Yep. Social theory of rights says, no, rights are not facts of reality that governments have to acknowledge. Rights are social conventions. What we do is we get together and we vote, and we decide what the rights are. America started to tilt in that direction. And, you've got economic rights and all kinds of other things that people are starting to assert, right? So by the time you get to World War I, a lot of that has already happened. It's not yet a complete transformation, which is why in the history of tomorrow, I talk about the challenges involved in taking a fundamental narrative, and then what do you do with it? How do you pile on more facts? How do you bring in all of the richness of history and account for that without it swamping your understanding, right? Because it's so easy at any point in history to just get totally focused in on the facts, and then you lose sight of the big picture.
So
how do you get facts but not lose sight of the frame, right?
Yeah. So
of American history, it's okay. We got to really have these periods, American and Americanistic. Those are the two fundamentals. But then we have to identify transitional periods, and then we can start to, better understand how do cultures change. It's a really important question.
that's great. That's good. So what I'm hearing from you, and for people who are just tuning in and trying to kind of trying to collect all of what you're saying and what we're saying, and this approach, present-centric approach, from what I understand is you have basically essentialized the most important types of cultures and the cultural blocks, and the one thing I haven't quite gotten into in the history of now in reading that is, do you kind of demonstrate why you've picked those particular cultural blocks to essentialize, and have you? Because what I'm thinking of is in terms of the American cultural block, if that's the right term to use in this, it's been very, very successful, and we're predominant in culturally throughout the world even now, because of certain because the fact that our political society has been so much more consistent to the nature of human beings in terms of rationality, creativity, and innovation, and that we've been so much more consistently able to practice being human, being rational, using reason, in this political situation, in terms of the better part of the American cultural bloc, do you talk about philosophically why that kind of follows, and that's why we're so predominant in our culture and culturally exporting our ideas?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not the focus, but definitely what I would say is I agree with you that what you named, right, and the commitment to natural rights and what that reflects in terms of human nature is obviously the fundamental success factor, right? The explanation for why America just leapfrogged over these long established civilizations and why they were so stagnant, right? And so yeah, those are important things for sure. But the purpose of present centrism is not to explain why certain things happen, but rather how did we get here? Mm-hmm. And yeah, inevitably you do have to get into issues of causation, and you do have normative questions that arise, such as, what is in fact a better culture? It's not a fundamental question in present centrism, because the cardinal cultures are the ones that are important. Important means worthy of attention, right? And actually, to be more specific, in present centrism, the standard of selectivity is not merely importance, which is a little bit of a broad term. I specifically, define the standard of selectivity as cognitive value significance. So in other words, what we're talking about there is, what is it that you need to know in order to understand what you're looking at? If you're trying to understand the world, whatever it is you think of it, for better and for worse, and everything that it is, how did it come to be this way? It's a really important discipline, because whatever it is you stand for, whatever it is you're hoping to achieve and perhaps affect cultural change, right? You have to know, how does history actually work? How does it unfold? What are the levers? What are the fulcrums? And how does this thing get moved, right? Because right now, we are not moving in a good direction. And that's quite inevitable. What we are currently experiencing is the final throes of Americanistic culture, and we are heading into, as I define it, a post-Americanistic cultural framework. So that's not going to be any fun. The question is going to be, of course, what do we do about it, right? Because inevitably, wherever we find ourselves, the question is always, well, okay, now what, right? How do we navigate, and how do we take actions which are going to bring about a better world, if that's possible? And what are our expectations, and in what ways, can we act, and how, what can we do, right? So
Yeah.
so definitely it's America's fantastic. It's unparalleled in all of human history in so many regards, right? So that's part of how the conclusion to the book, what I say in the conclusion. Yeah, we're in trouble. Okay, but there's never been a culture like America. So whatever it is you want to say, you have to factor that in, and there still remain, and there will remain in post-Americanistic culture. There will remain elements that tie back all the way to American culture and all of its virtues, and some of the unique virtues of Americanistic culture. And so those are values, and they will help. And I'm really pleased to say that a lot of the vectors that are bringing about post-Americanistic culture, we're seeing some counteraction. It's not effective, but it's not nothing either. Right. So in other words, we're seeing a lot of backlash with what we call woke. Right. And so that's a good sign. Right. The boundaries of post-Americanistic culture are being fenced in. Right. It's this egalitarianism and all of this victimist mentality and all of the things that are a part of that cultural movement are now facing some serious opposition. And so that's good. As I talk about in the book, there's no way we don't get to a new version of America. However, what exactly the identity of that version is still in effect up for grabs. There's a limit to how much we can change about it, and there's definitely some pretty awful stuff. But we're not, it's. Plenty of cultures have been through awful stuff,
right,
incomparably worse than what we're going through, and they're still around, right? So America being what it is, I still feel a sense of hope, and I believe there are mechanisms for carrying us through this. It'll be hard, but that's my intention, to provide history in a new way and empowering way to those that are capable and worthy of wielding it, and that will be one of our tools.
Right. Good. So in other words, you're presenting history in a way that you're saying these are the facts, whether you like it or not. These are the facts, and implicitly, and that you are implying that natural rights are individual rights, and freedom, and constitutionalism, and and limited government, and all of these ideas politically and also philosophically in terms of reason and rational egoism and all of this. That's kind of, you're not talking about any of those kind of objectivist concepts in your books, but you are implying them by laying out the facts in the way that you are. I think that's what I'm getting at.
In some cases, I'm perfectly explicit, and when I talk about the social theory of rights versus the natural theory, I just come down and say, look, I know which one of these is the better one, and I'm gonna go ahead and lay it out for you guys. This one's better than that one, but that doesn't matter, because in the sense of how to understand the world that we came from, right, or that we're in now, and how we got there. And so, sometimes I will declare myself and say, this is where I stand. But that's not the primary purpose of history, right? So right. I'm a guide to the world as it is, in every one of its wonderful and thought out. So it's not my place primarily to promote or anything other than history. But nonetheless,
So
I wouldn't be where I am without that framework of values. And
right.
I definitely, when I teach kids, for instance, I never hide that. Okay, when I teach kids, I'm like, absolutely, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, greatest thing that was ever said in the history of politics. So if you want to know where I stand, I will not hide that. Okay,
right.
And so those things, are part of the story. But that doesn't change, right? Okay, well, here's what happened. Here's where we are now. America started with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and James Madison. Okay, but now America has Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. So, right? Where we are is what it is.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that what you would hope for a resurgence of a self-assertive America, an America that again goes back to being a republic, a defender of individual rights, versus being a democracy and wanting to put democracy, out into the world. You wrote in the new book, among the many things that saddens me about this trend is that it is obviously related to a resurgence of nationalism in America and elsewhere in the Western world. Nowadays, this interview in 2024, people conflate nationalism with an America first, America's self-assertion, America's self-esteem. They put those two together, and unfortunately, that takes the form of Donald Trump. And to me, it seems counterintuitive. I would think nationalism would naturally lead to internationalism. If America has the self-esteem it should have, it should be eager to trade. It should be eager to engage, because there's no weakness in that in a rational policy. But our nationalists, they fear trade, they fear foreign people, they fear immigration, they're afraid of globalism, they're afraid of engaging with the world. Is there hope for the United States or any other cultural bloc to change course in that regard and adopt a real position of strength, which embraces trade and immigration and generally normal relationships internationally? What do you see in that regard as given history and given where we're at right now?
Yeah, there isn't any hope in the short term. Okay, what we've got is, on the one side, we've got neoliberalism, which is essentially indistinguishable from neoconservatism, and that, as I explain in the history of tomorrow, I'm not gonna give you any spoilers here. There'd be too many terms to explain, but it is, ironically, neoliberalism does assert an America first type of foreign policy. It is a mongrel, and it is ugly, and it is the reason why we have things like the Russia-Ukraine war. But so it's very much, as you pointed out, you would think nationalism nationalism is a loaded term. It is a form of collectivism. So it's better to avoid that if we want to associate it with, let's say, rational self-interest as a foreign policy. That would be the way to characterize the founding fathers. Nationalism is unfortunately collectivism, and so now that's where we find ourselves now, is with a nationalism that is, America is predominant, can do whatever it wants, it bosses everybody else around. And of course, cardinal cultures like Russia and China are like, I'm not putting up with that. Right? So they're going to do whatever they can to disrupt that system. Europe also is trying to maintain its status as a cardinal culture, but basically Europe does what America tells them. And they tried to pull out of that, but part of the reason why we got to the Russia-Ukraine war is the Europeans kept expanding the European Union, and Bill Clinton in particular said, if they do that and NATO sits still, then we're going to lose our primacy, so we got to expand too. And before you know it, we're just growing and growing and growing, and NATO, for no good reason, is all of a sudden on Russia's borders. And the Russians are like, you told us you wouldn't do that. And we're upset. Stop it. And basically, Clinton and Bush and Obama, they said, whatever, you don't count, we could care less. So, it's basically, as John Mearsheimer said, I'm not a big fan of John Mearsheimer, but nonetheless, it's a winner take all policy. So we're stronger than you, we're taking it. And the Russians said, no, you're not. And so now we have this catastrophe. And so this is not self-interest. There's no rational self-interest involved in extending NATO into Eastern Europe, let alone Ukraine, which is essentially Russia. And so it's like, okay, that makes no sense. So the nationalism that we have is a mess. Now, Donald Trump, surprisingly enough, is a different kind of nationalist. I guess you could say he's more of, this is another loaded term that I don't like, more of an isolationist, a little bit more of an internationalist, in the sense that he wants America first. Americans take care of America's business. And yeah, okay, maybe we can help out every once in a while. Maybe we can go shake hands with the Koreans, and do things like that, which is kind of naive, but whatever. All right. So, but mostly we take care of business at home, right? And so that's that. Of the two, that's healthier than neoliberalism. But neither of those is rational self-interest. And so in that regard, yeah, foreign policy is definitely one of the big reasons why we find ourselves here. And so, we have the failure of the war on terror, and we have so many, we have this question of the flashpoint of Taiwan and when is that going to blow, and all kinds of really, really difficult questions. Israel, and Iran seem to be destined for war. And so what are all these terrible things happening? We profess to be, the world's policemen, and we're supposed to be preventing wars. Clearly, we're not doing that. And so that's a challenging aspect of the post-Americanistic world. The more deeply important one for Americans, they're interconnected, of course, but nonetheless, the more important one for Americans is the history of the social contract and where we find ourselves in that story. And so in the history of now, or really in the beginning of the history of tomorrow, I talk about, okay, we've got the American Republic, that original incarnation with its particular set of values and strange incoherencies, evolving after the Civil War into Americanistic democracy. All right, are we still there? Like, isn't that still kind of where we are? Or don't the politicians always say, our democracy, our democracy? Well, yeah, but notice that Biden and Harris, what are they all about? We have to save our democracy. Wait a minute, is it really in trouble? Like, actually, yeah, it is. Ironically, of course, mostly from them. This language is a reflection of a really, important cultural change that's going on. We've got a lot of different aspects to it, but just to name the one that, of course, is on most people's minds. Okay, looks like we have Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris versus RFK Jr. Okay, now this is a perfect way to capture what's going on in politics, because Donald Trump, as the leader of the Republican Party, that is an invasive candidacy. Republicans didn't want him. They don't like him. All the Americanistic thinkers in the Republican Party would much rather have another Mitt Romney. They would much rather have like a Marco Rubio or somebody else, right? The character that upholds kind of the same sort of framework of what they used to stand for. Donald Trump came in, just absolutely, right, grabbed onto this phenomenon, this fact that Americans were unhappy, and the fact that if the Republicans stayed the way that they were, they're going to lose every single election. So basically, he came in and he said, look, I've got a new idea, well, not new, right, but make America great again. We're gonna just take this over, and we get the MAGA phenomenon, and that obviously clearly appeals to a wide swath of the population, right? So MAGA is a post-Americanistic phenomenon. It is the new incarnation of the Republican Party. Basically, the old one's gone. It'll never be back. So whatever happens from now on with the Republicans will be post-MAGA, or it'll be MAGA, or it'll be post-MAGA. It'll be whatever the heck they come up with after that, right? It's, basically you can look forward to people like J.D. Vance and Vivek Ramaswamy and these characters kind of coming in and being trained in the next administration, assuming Trump makes it, and they will kind of keep going from there. And it'll be a MAGA party. So that's a new party. That did not exist. There was no Make America Great Again. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, it was, we are the greatest. And we're going to go to the moon. And we're going to tear down the wall. And we're going to do everything that we want to do because we're already the greatest. So we didn't have to make it great again. That's not an Americanistic sentiment. That's a post-Americanistic sentiment. It's saying, look where we've ended up. Uh-oh, we got to fix this. Right? So that's very much a post-Americanistic artifact. As far as the Democrats are concerned, there's two things going on there. It all started with Obama, of course, but the fact that they anointed Kamala Harris without any legitimate process of putting her in that position when Biden just fell apart is basically a really interesting illustration of where the Democratic Party is now, right? Because had they done it properly, they would have had to have a convention, and they would have had candidates come in and really vote over who's going to take over. And if they had done that, we might have gotten a better candidate. I mean, Kamala Harris is literally a moron. And so the fact that they picked her is just unbelievable, right? This is like suicidal, practically. But the fact that she is now the candidate is really instructive, because it's DEI on steroids. It is like, wow, how did they get here? Well, they're in a trap. The Democrats are trapped. Ideologically, they can't help themselves. The formula that brought in Obama, they basically cannot see a way through past that. So they're now in that framework. Fascinating to see. RFK Jr. comes, out of that. He says, well, they won't let me even run to be the candidate, right? Well, okay, he's a Kennedy. He's a Kennedy. This is the ultimate Americanistic name on the Democrat side, right? I mean, this was the name, the Kennedys. And so John F. Kennedy was the hero of the Democrats. And so, okay, now the Kennedy family has split, right? Factionalized. They forget RFK Jr. Okay, but his now, competing candidacy is another sign. The party system in America has a tendency to shift around these really critical junctures as the social contract changes. And so we've had these little dabbling with third-party candidates like Ross Perot a little while back and so on, but really we're there. I'm going to go out on a limb, even though I'm terrible with presidential elections. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to predict that RFK Jr. will get more votes than Kamala Harris, and that will shatter the Democratic Party. If I'm wrong, fine, I'm wrong. But on the other hand, I have I really don't have any confidence in the electoral system anymore. So that's a difficult topic, of course, to discuss. But what can you do, right? So we'll see. It's nonetheless, it doesn't matter, if I'm right, it doesn't, and it also doesn't matter if it's Trump or Harris. It's all post-Americanist. So, and what I mean by that, unfortunately, is Americans now are so split that, and you could see it in the language of politics. And Biden tried to do it in his inaugural address, unity, right? But and RFK Jr. talks about how he's a unity candidate. He's trying to bring Americans back together again. On the other hand, Trump is saying, no, forget that. And of course, Harris is saying, forget that, right? It's like, no, we're not going to agree to disagree anymore. We're taking over, and we're going to impose our agenda on the rest of Americans, which of course is scary from either side, right? And so I discuss what the full significance of that is in the history of tomorrow. It's not good, but I will leave it to the readers to discover exactly what I mean.
Yeah. Great. I'm curious I'd like to know what you think about Leonard Peikoff's the dim hypothesis and that kind of system of philosophical categorization.
As I said, present centrism is a mode. Where did I get that? I got that from Leonard Peikoff. And so, it's the relationship between present centrism and dim hypothesis is a little bit of a tender spot, because unfortunately, a very important missing component of the dim hypothesis is the study of historiography from a modal perspective. Mm-hmm. And had Leonard Peikoff done that, of course, he would not have had the benefit of present centrism as an established mode to be able to demonstrate that there was such a thing as as he calls it, integrated history. And so unfortunately there's a gap there, and there are some issues in terms of ultimately how well that thesis plays out. But nonetheless, there's a lot of that which I found very instructive, and without which I probably would not have been able to as clearly formulate elements of the thesis. So I definitely have a certain, I definitely respect what was done there, and I have to acknowledge definitely a certain dependence.
Good, cool.
Yeah, I was going to ask, and maybe I still will, the current presidential election, Harris and Trump, it just sounds wrong to even say that, but the current U.S. presidential election, like every election I recall, now I've been around for 6 decades. Well, I guess I've only been aware of politics for 4 of those. Every election that I can recall was treated as, this is the most important election in our lifetimes, and get out and vote and save the world from this particular election. Is this election that big a deal? That's such a silly way to put it, but is this the most important election in our lifetime? And do you have any sense of how is it that every 4 years we think, okay, this is the one, and if you don't vote right, it's the end of the country, it's the end of the world?
Well, I think part of the reason for the hyperbole is people don't know history. So it's like they forgot what happened 4 years ago. So it's like all of a sudden what's right in front of them is, of course, the most important thing. And most people really only engage with history in terms of politics and what's going on right around them. So it's definitely a little bit of a short-term mentality that drives that kind of hyperbole. But having said that, I would say that the answer to your question is yes and no. Of course, there's a lot of that. And so the yes part of the answer is that what kind of post-Americanistic culture we're going to get does depend on the outcome, very much. And so if we have Trump administration, then we're going to see, I hope, some terrific, wonderful things, such as the abolition of the Department of Education. That would by itself perhaps salvage the entire administration, but I doubt it. And then on the other hand, what will we see? Well, we will see basically the IRS agents fired and hired into the INS, and we will have an army traipsing through the United States, picking up people off the streets, terrifying to watch, and it's going to be ugly.
I always think of Barack Obama and those boxcars he was gathering out in Arizona and taking all of the ammunition, and he was going to round us up. And
with FEMA.
He got reelected, and somehow that didn't happen.
Yeah, right. But Trump is going to have to come through on this. There's no way around it, because Americanistic culture is not equipped to assimilate the people that have arrived. And so it's going to be ugly. So, that's a completely separate issue as to, what would a rational, again, of course, it's a completely separate issue. What would be a rational immigration policy, right? So we're not even close. We're not even close to that ballpark. So forget it. So let's just talk about what we have and what's going to happen, right? So if it's Trump, it's going to be super ugly in that particular regard. If you get a Harris administration, oh, well, my God, the IRS isn't just going to be, it's going to be knocking on everybody's door. And she promises more taxes and everything else, and everything that's on really a very exaggerated progressive / woke agenda. So that's going to be ugly in its own way. Right? So it's a matter of pick your poison. And I typically do not advocate in terms of, as a historian, I kind of stay on the sidelines and watch. I'm not particularly interested in saying, I think you should vote for this person or that person. My interest is, in understanding, okay, if it's this, then that, it's this, then that, and trying to help people understand, well, here's what you're going to get. If you choose that, this is what you get, and so on. And here are going to be the consequences, right? And clearly, that's one thing that Americans also don't understand about the elections is, this, as you said, this characterization. This is the most important election of all, right? And so, okay, the Democrats succeeded in having Barack Obama elected twice, right? And then they thought, well, now it's just going to be the passing of the baton, and Clinton's going to take over. Like, this was the most obvious thing. And of course, what did I predict? Yeah, Clinton will be president. I mean, come on. And what happened? Now Trump wins, right?
Well, there's no way that Donald Trump is going to be president of the United States.
It was.
Well, the first four,
problem of unintended consequences, right? This is a classic illustration of how we're not in control of history. And so Donald Trump comes along, right? And he thinks, okay, I'm going to clean all this up. Well, of course, he encountered incredible obstacles in the form of the deep state, and he was counteracted by many of his own cabinet, and Mike Pence was a worthless pick, and so on. Okay, according to his, let's say, from his point of view, right? According to the things that he was trying to do. He did not achieve those things. And of course, ultimately, he did not achieve those things because Americans then supposedly elected Joe Biden, right? So this is like a wild swing, right? So in terms of what's going on, I wouldn't be surprised if it swings exactly in the opposite direction. We are at that time, I describe it in the book, I call it the wobble. You've got this spinning top and it's just kind of going and it looks good and everything, but pretty soon, whoa, right? And then when it's wobbling, the changes are more dramatic and wow, it's really, it's not easy to go through. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Trump is reelected, but it doesn't particularly, affect the thesis in that regard. It just affects, what flavor are we going to get of post-Americanistic culture. It'll be awful no matter what, but
I'm curious to see if Kamala wins the election. I kind of doubt it, but I don't know. It's actually, I have no idea, honestly. I doubt that the game show host will win. That's what we called Donald Trump all throughout his presidency. Is wait, isn't he that game show host?
No, he was the wrestling promoter.
Oh, he did he sell steaks?
He was on the world
Trump steaks. So anyway, so if I'm curious, I'm wondering if there is. So I was actually in the GOP for a number of years before Trump came on the scene. When he came on the scene, I left and I let everybody know what was going to happen. I was correct. I said he's going to raise the deficit up to another 10 trillion, and in 4 years, or actually I think it was 9 trillion. And he's going to and he's going to be an authoritarian, and he's going to completely eradicate everything that the Tea Party worked for, and goodbye. So I wonder if the whole idea of fiscal responsibility, limited government, and scaling back Social Security and social welfare programs and corporate welfare programs will ever enter the mind of anybody on the right ever again.
Is it too late?
Yeah, not during the post-Americanistic period. That's already faded. Fated. We're done on that front. And I present the story of political economy as one of the chapters in post-Americanist in the history of tomorrow, and I'm convinced of that. And as far as the deficits are concerned, that's baked in. That's baked into the cake. There's no way to run a fiat money currency system and a fractional reserve banking system without expanding the money supply at a certain rate, which is a rather complicated thesis, of course. But basically, the minute you start cutting back, you're going to have a Great Depression. So no president wants to be in charge for that. And I'm not going to fault Trump or Biden or anybody for that. That's out of their league. And so basically what we're going to get is some sort of technocratic coping strategy that's going to be implemented. And so, the world economic system is so integrated, and the PhDs that are in charge of everything have been studying all kinds of different examples. And in some regards, for instance, Japan is way ahead of where America is in terms of its fiscal, insanity. And so modeling the way that Japan has been able to maintain its currency in relation to America, which has way more, as they say, exorbitant privilege in terms of being the world reserve currency. America can get away with so much, it boggles the mind. And so basically, there was a time after the 2007-2008 financial crisis where I was convinced, well, this is it. We are within years of the crash. And it took me a while to back off from that, to realize, oh, no, this system has its features that are remarkably resilient. And whether or not this turns into fully programmable currencies, it's going to be digital mostly, of course, and nobody's going to be able to avoid it, and so many variables involved there, which are going to be pretty ugly. If they do that, the Chinese have already done elements of this. The Japanese have already fiddled with negative interest rates. There's so many technocratic solutions that they can implement, which will really repress the entire financial system. Nobody can do anything about it.
So I mean, we're not ever. Do you think we'll ever get to the point where we'll have to be Greece and go on an austerity program and ask European countries for help? I mean, I don't know.
There's nobody really to rescue us.
No.
Yeah, there's nobody to rescue us. The only possibility that I see, this is still very much a hypothesis, and I certainly haven't plotted this out to significant extent. But the only hypothesis I have, and this does depend to a certain extent on Trump versus Harris, for instance, because I don't think it can happen in a mega world. But the only hypothesis I have, and the only way, because the model that's been employed in order to make these things work in the fiat money system, is that you have to continue to scale up, which is why we go from billion-dollar deficits to trillion-dollar deficits, and so on. You have to keep on growing, and the only way that can be done, there's only one more level, and that is the complete globalization of the financial system. And so at that point, there have been some experts out there. There's one named Jim Rickards. They talk about the rise of the IMF and of special drawing rights as a new kind of currency. What you do there is you amalgamate all the debt and all the debt instruments and all the currencies, and you end up with a new currency system. I think that's probably where we'll end up. Some sort of very strange globalized currency that everybody has to use. It's entirely digital. Too bad for you if you're not involved. There'll be some countries that don't have it, of course, and they'll be left behind. But basically all the major cultures will have to participate in that. And partly because pretty much everybody's in the same boat. So China is, if the Chinese don't participate, their economy will crash. If the Russians don't participate, their economy will crash. Everybody is overextended. Everybody's been working based on the same models. Chinese have the largest bubble in the history of the world, and their real estate market and everything else is just staggering. So, they're in big trouble. And so I think there's a lot of leverage there for all of the participants to say, everybody get together. We'll have a new, what they call Bretton Woods. There's this arrangement in 1944 that led to the modern international economic order. There'll be Bretton Woods 2, and it will be, okay, we're going to combine all our currencies in a basket, and we're going to issue global debt. And then there'll be a whole new market. And of course, it'll be intermingled with carbon credits and all kinds of fun stuff for Warren Buffett to invest in. So, that'll be the full post-Americanistic system in that way.
I could see that, but in a way I can't. I can almost see the present system evolving into a de facto version of that without it actually being declared.
Yeah, it could very well be. That's kind of the model that I discuss in terms of foreign policy. You talked about nationalism. What we're going to have is a kind of stealth nationalism. And so, we'll get there kind of despite ourselves and no matter what, because if you follow through and there's no way, there are no competing paradigms. You use that word, which is fine with me. There really are no competing paradigms, and so therefore there's only pretty much one direction to go until you hit the wall.
Yeah.
And that takes me to kind of the last two. As we get to the top of the hour, now we have no time restrictions. We can go as long as we like, but I don't want to test the patience of our audience. I have two more questions. The first one is, how is globetrotting going, the digital nomad lifestyle? Our friend Bonnie in the chat says, so where do we move to? I'm always interested. As I say, every election is the biggest election in our lifetimes. And a side effect of that is that people will say, well, if the other side is elected, I'm moving to Canada. If the other side is elected, I need to leave the United States, which I always think is as valid as it was 4 years ago, which is to say not at all. But on the more positive side, we could go just about anywhere, and you've chosen to do that. You are in Albania?
Now? Yeah. So basically, I'm just kind of we're just kind of moving around the Mediterranean. We love the climate, and typically, there's a lot of very nice people. They're very friendly and welcoming and helpful. And so there are some places we're kind of avoiding. They're kind of, going against tourists. But Athens was a little bit like that when we were there. We were a little bit dismayed by that. But some of the other cultures we've been in, Malta, Cyprus, Montenegro, they are really wonderful in terms of welcoming, and especially Americans. They really have an admiration for America. Albania has just an absolute crush on America, and so it's like when they just want to know you, they want to help you, and they want to everything. So it's just really nice experience in that particular regard. So, you know, when you ask the question, where do I move to? I don't have an answer. And I don't even have an answer for myself. And so, in other words, I've tried different places. We lived in Brazil for 3 years. You know, we've lived in different places, and I've tried different places. And for myself, at the moment, because I don't have an answer, then we're not settling down. We're just on this, you know, what people call slow travel type of a mode, which comes with its own stresses and challenges. Absolutely. We definitely go through ups and downs in the experience. On the other hand, it's just there's a hyper novelty to it, which is a really interesting feature where you're always in new places, and it's always exciting, and it's always, you know, kind of like meeting a new person for the first time, making friends with somebody for the first time, over and over and over again. You go to these new places. So it's nice, and, you know, there's no commitment involved. But, you know, so in that regard, there's a little dissatisfaction, because if I could, yeah, I would rather live in the same place. You know, I would say, you know, something like 9 months out of the year, and then, you know, dabble in other things 3 months out, but always have a place to come back to. But I just cannot see myself in that particular moment. So if you are, you know, digitally empowered, so to speak, right? If your lifestyle, if your career permits you to move, then yeah, being a digital nomad can be the answer. And there are fantastic options out there. You know, depending on how rich you are, there's a guy out there that runs a thing called Nomad Capitalist, and you know, he advises people on how to do that. And I implement the things that I can, and just ignore the things that I can't, and it's worked so far. You know, I may run into things in the future that I won't like, but for the time being, it's working out.
So, as a historian, what's your favorite museum, or do you have one?
Oh, museums are so tedious. No, I'm not a big museum guy. I mean, I love art museums. I mean, the Louvre is the Met in New York is spectacular. Yeah, I'm an art museum guy.
Have you ever been to the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village?
Yeah, I'm not. I know that you're associated with that in some way.
You need to, because it's I mean, it's a you know, it's an indoor museum, but you know, originally Henry Ford didn't have it as a museum at all. It was a school, so he was kind of training children, kind of a hands-on approach to history. He called history bunk, with, you know, wrote memorization of all of the dates and all this, and so I think he might have appreciated your approach. But yeah, so at the Henry Ford, though, I mean, it's you know, you're right. I mean, it can be a little bit tedious, but we do have a lot of themes and a lot of, you know, we talk about, actually, I'll forward you something. We actually have kind of an educational branch to our nonprofit organization, and we have, it's sort of a kind of an educational approach called Model I. But I'll send that to you. See what you think. But yeah, we are kind of more of a hands-on immersion into living history sort of place. You know, not so much in terms of essentialization, but it is it's the Museum of American Innovation. That's the general theme of it.
Well, I'll tell you what. If I could ever come to the attention of Elon Musk, what I would tell him, because apparently he homeschools, but what I would tell him is that, of course, he needs to adopt present centrism into the curriculum, but I would tell him as well that what I would do is I would recruit engineers, and that basically the high school curriculum would be basically a John Gall curriculum, and every student, in order to graduate, would have to build a Model T. Mm-hmm. And so you would basically, you know, this would be part of a historical induction in order to understand how engines are made, what tires are made of, where does the rubber come from, where does the You made the
we
steel
talk
and
about that.
but that would be my curriculum in terms of so-called industrial arts or whatever you want to
Yeah.
call it. Every student, in order to graduate, would have to build their own Model T. And of course, it would be guided. And Musk would have to be involved because you'd have to set up an assembly line. And you'd have to learn all about that kind of technology, which would be spectacular. But that would require enormous investment in that particular aspect. But yeah, I love the idea. Henry Ford, obviously, a hero in terms of human history. And the Model T is the cardinal anchor fact of the history of industrial civilization in and of itself. So, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so when you're ever in the neighborhood around Michigan, just come on by. I'll give you a tour.
Fantastic.
So, the nomad lifestyle, where do we go when the next election happens and we don't like the result? You know my opinion. I don't think anybody needs to leave town. We survived 4 years of Donald Trump before. We'll survive 4 more years. I know second term, everything changes. He does worse things. But was Obama that much worse in his second term? Same thing with Kamala Harris, who is the young, frisky version of Joe Biden. We survived 4 years of Joe Biden. We would, I don't think it's going to happen, but we would survive 4 years of Kamala Harris. Not that she won't do bad things. Not that there's not going to be a lot to fight, a lot to recover from. We will get through it. But that's just my take on do we go to Canada? Do we leave town? Do we move to Albania? Only if it's worth it for its own sake, but not in response to the election. I love the fact that you've adopted that lifestyle and that, I'm sure more adventures await. The second thing that I wanted to say, and this is really the reason to have this interview, you, of course, are, in our circles, a famous historian. Folks can go to knowableworld.com to see both the Knowable World opportunities there for grades K through 2, but of course, history at our house for grades 3 through 12. You've got your books. We talked last time about the history of now. Now you've got the history of tomorrow coming out. And this week, starting on Saturday, a set of courses on this. How can folks, adults who want to know history through the Scott Powell lens, how can folks find out about this new course that you've got just until the end of the week to sign up for?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as the first session is concerned, that's certainly true. We're not quite going to work on a weekly schedule. There are going to be a few breaks along the way. So there's certainly, if somebody wants to come in a couple weeks in, there's no problem there. And recordings are available, so students can attend exclusively by recordings if they want. If the time slot isn't work for them and so on. So it's going to be Saturdays, middle of the day. That doesn't work for a lot of folks. So I understand that. Recordings will be available. And so I sent you a link by email, Robert, which I'd appreciate if you post to the...
Yes, that will be posted into the description and shared throughout the week as well as we lead up to Saturday. I meant to ask you, because last time we talked about the history of now, the course that you gave starting in March of 2024. How did that go?
Yeah, pretty good. I was happy. I had some new, young adults that were interested in present centrism, and I think they were surprised. Because we didn't just read from the book, we didn't just talk about it and share thoughts. What I tried to do was I tried to show them what's being done in the history of now from the perspective of the historian that's now written the history of tomorrow. And my own growing appreciation for my own work basically allowed me to show them, okay, this is what's going on. And this is what you have to understand, and this is how you have to approach this if you want your own understanding to be present-centric. So that was quite well received, and hopefully the same will be true of the history of tomorrow. The difficulty level goes up considerably, I will say that. It's not easy to understand that there is such a thing as hierarchy in history, and that's part of the thesis that explain that there is indeed such a thing. And if you really want to understand it well, you've got a hard task ahead of you. But if you join the history of tomorrow, I'll be there to hold your hand, so you'll have the best chance that you possibly can in that regard. Just wanted to say, Knowable World is now the brand. There is no other. So in other words, Knowable World is K through 12.
Oh,
it is
okay.
Everything we do. And so, yes, the History Detectives program is for the youngest kids, and then we have the live classes and recordings for everything from 3 through 12. And in fact, this year, for the first time ever, I have some qualified students, including my own as a senior, and so therefore they are going to be in the advanced history program. This is literally going to be far and away the greatest history program that's ever been given at that level, for sure. And already when my students go on to college, the history professors are all like, how do you know this? And they're all baffled by the fact that there are people that are historically literate. And so they're like, how do you know? Well, I'm barely scratching the surface. The advanced history program is going to be, it's like when Hugh Axton says to Dagny, these men are normal, right? These are not. So that's what I mean is my kids, smart kids. Yeah, I'm honored and privileged to have some smart kids in my program. But if they're taught properly, they turn into geniuses. So, I mean, the stuff that they know compared to what took me into my 40s to get anywhere near what it is that they know. So this is what education's all about. It's about giving them advantages that we never had, and therefore they'll be able to tell the world in ways that we have not. And so, yeah, that's really all the things I'm doing right now. The advanced history program is, to me, the most inspiring in that regard, because it really, I think it's the chance that we're going to have to really create some geniuses that are going to blow people away with what they know. And so I'm excited about that.
Well, folks, if you are an adult like me and not a young person, but you still want that ability to blow people away with your understanding, your grasp of history, and more than that, more selfishly, more personally, that ability to be in the world, to understand where we are at, how we got here, and what tomorrow looks like, you got to sign up. We will share that information in the descriptions, both on Facebook Live and on YouTube, as well as the audio version, which will be available immediately after this episode. Scott, another outstanding discussion. If you missed it, folks, definitely listen to that March episode of 5 Minutes with Robert and Amy Nasir, in which we interviewed Scott. We got a little more into the history of now and some of the aspects that I could have brought up this time too. The Platonic view of history, all that gets blown away. Definitely listen to that earlier interview as well. Scott,
yeah,
thank you very much for your time your afternoon this morning. And anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up?
Actually, just one thing which people will appreciate.
Yes.
The price of the course is $300 for 10 sessions. But if you mention Robert and Amy, it's $250.
Oh.
All right.
Well, there you go. $50 off right there just for mentioning that. And I'd be very interested, Scott, to hear the feedback on that. How many of you all, because I see the chat is active and I know we have listeners after the fact, got into this seminar, The History of Tomorrow, because of this discussion? Thank you, Scott. Appreciate your time this fine day, and we look forward to sharing the information on that seminar and talking to you again and hearing just exactly how it went.
Yes.
Thank you, folks, for listening. We will be back on Sunday at 6 o'clock for 5 Minutes with Robert and Amy Nasir. In the meantime, have each and every one of you an outstanding day, all the success